It is with great pleasure that we welcome Dr. Canne. He is both a graduate chemist and a graduate in business administration, serving as a board member for Vernunftkraft AV, which makes him a true expert. As a board member of this association, you are precisely the expert we would have wanted for city events. We only had 10 minutes there, and we truly could have made excellent use of your professional expertise, but unfortunately, the city did not allow us to. Yes, now I'm really looking forward to your presentation so that we can finally get some facts and not just pure ideology or mere whitewashing.
Well then, a good evening to you all, ladies and gentlemen, from me too. I've already been briefly introduced. Let me say a few more words about Vernunftkraft.de. We are a non-profit association and we've been around for about 12 years now. We are active nationwide, have state associations, regional groups, and we typically integrate citizen initiatives into our community. Our mission, and this is also our non-profit statutory purpose, is to impart knowledge. In these times, it's often crucially important that we also provide knowledge here, for example, regarding the energy transition. How are we to properly assess these matters? That is the significant task that we are facing. For that very specific purpose, I travel throughout the land. For that purpose, I publish many articles. You'll find me in various places. If you Google me, you'll find many articles by me. You'll find YouTube videos. Social media also plays a role. I have an X account with a large reach, but I do all this voluntarily because we are non-profit and voluntary, and that's important to us. And it's also important to us that we are not affiliated with any industry, nor do we receive donations from them. We also don't belong to any political party, which is essential for a non-profit organization to always reiterate we are politically independent. And this is something that's personally very important to us. And in this role, I was very pleased to accept tonight's invitation to speak on this subject with a clear focus on economics, as we've already heard some statements, to offer a few thoughts on it. I usually always begin my lectures by presenting these two beautiful quotes right here. One is the lovely quote, "Wind and sun send no bill," which dates back to the 90s from Mr. Franz Alt. I always find it quite astonishing how often I still come across this quote. It is actually quite unbelievable to me. One should really know better by now. Or then, about 15 years later, Mr. Tritton from the Greens came, maintaining that the promotion of renewable energies would only cost an average household about €1 per month. That's as much as a single scoop of ice cream. I believe by now you could buy an entire ice cream parlor with that amount. But these are statements that also characterize the discussion from 2010 to 2020. We have switched off the nuclear power stations, which was probably the single biggest mistake made in the entire post-war period. We have also now begun to decommission base-load power plants that have been operating successfully for a very long time, and somehow the promised rewards and benefits that we were told about have not fully arrived. Just take a look right now. Yes. And the phase we are currently in, I call it the great disillusionment. Because this disillusionment, there was a very good report from the Federal Court of Auditors about it, which Mr. Habeck indignantly dismissed, but it contained a sentence that one can only read aloud over and over again. Supply security is endangered, Ms. Thoma. Electricity is quite expensive, yes. And the federal government is unable to comprehensively evaluate the effects of the energy transition on the landscape, on nature, and on the environment. And not much has really changed there either. Nevertheless, even throughout the entire traffic light government's term, the course remained strictly pro-energy transition, pro 100% renewables. Things have changed a little now with Ms. Reiche at the Ministry of Economy. She has and I would recommend this as reading for the next few days because I don't want to go into too much detail right now. She then published a monitoring report in September. And this monitoring report, specifically the one from the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, which was prepared by the Institute of Energy Economics, this monitoring report has for the very first time provided a clear and comprehensive assessment. So instead of everything being free, no bill, no free scoop of ice cream, it states very clearly here the assumption that electricity from renewable energies can practically be provided at zero cost is incorrect when considering the entire system. What truly lies behind this statement, I will then explain in more detail over the next 45 minutes. I always find it regrettable that a publication like this isn't more clearly presented in the media. There might be reasons, I just don't know. I've finally decided to omit one quote for tonight. That was the famous quote from Mr. Olaf Scholz 2 years ago. Through investments in climate protection, we will achieve economic growth like in the 1950s and 60s. For context, back then we had an economic growth rate of 8%. I don't know, perhaps Mr. Scholz just got the sign wrong.
Or maybe he just can't remember it.
Well, so the point is, 2 years ago, I gave presentations where I showed many charts and said, look here, the danger lies here. Today, I can leave all that out. Today, I can simply tell you, just look in the daily newspaper. You'll find for every single day now a report on deindustrialization. And quite honestly, the stakes are nowhere as high as they are here in Baden-Württemberg. What is happening here as deindustrialization, that is truly massive. And then I keep realizing it's not really reflected in the press. It's also not really picked up by politicians. Why is that actually? But the determining factors are always the same. The high energy costs, and then they say, oh, that's a global phenomenon. It is not. If I look at BASF a year ago at their financial press conference, the CFO said all our sites are profitable except for Ludwigshafen. This has been the situation for years. This problem has existed for a very long time. We are finding that nothing is being done about these rising energy prices caused by the energy transition. Well, then BASF will eventually go and build their newest ethylene cracker in China, and that's just how it is. You know, even if one is not an energy expert or doesn't truly grasp the full scope of these matters, it is simply not comprehensible for me to understand when such a negative development actually occurs, and that, of all places, right here in Baden-Württemberg. I can tell you one thing, when I finished my studies at the University of Saarbrücken, Baden-Württemberg was the model workplace. All of that is gone today. You're actually losing your entire energy-intensive industry. And why is it not the case then that people say, we really need to think about this again? Why do people let themselves be convinced that, oh yes, we just need to push the energy transition further now, more wind turbines, more solar, more of the very things that have brought about this crisis? And then at some point there will be a magical turning point, won't there? I really don't understand it sometimes. The empirical evidence, the experience we're now gaining from this disastrous deindustrialization tells a completely different story. And I sometimes compare that to parents of a school child, where the child in 7th grade falls from a previous level of 2 to a level of 5. You see the grades right there, it's a failing grade, but the parents do nothing about it. Only the consequences follow. In school, it leads to not being promoted. And what not being promoted means in school is economic decline, especially here in Baden-Württemberg. And that also impacts the communities. I just read while preparing for today in the latest news from Baden that in Rastatt, 99% of the business tax revenues are collapsing. So do we know, is it truly clear what this situation here implies? You don't need to come with kindergarten level explanations. What you're advocating for here, it's not just destroying jobs, it's also ruining our economic viability. Then tomorrow in the Bundestag, you won't need to argue yourself senseless about a pension package. We are losing highly paid industrial jobs and along with them our vital contribution revenues. But now I've ranted enough. I'd rather move on a bit to the facts about how our electricity mix has changed. I won't go into every single detail. Here it is, contrasted left 2015, right 2024. And the first thing we'll see once again is that our energy demand will rise. I don't know. Right now it's falling quite drastically, yes, due to deindustrialization, that's quite clear. The moment we have a 25% production slump in energy-intensive industry, we also need less power.
In the end, we'll even achieve CO2 targets through industrialization. Yeah, no problem. That's how it'll be.
So, the first observation is that our electricity demand in 2015 compared to today has significantly decreased, just like our standard of living. So, the second point is the electricity mix has undergone a significant change. You can see on the left side, the coal and nuclear power was also still present, and these have now been entirely replaced by solar and wind energy. So, that's not a one-to-one equivalent because one is a reliable supply of electricity and the other is not reliable but intermittent power generation. That makes a very, very big difference, especially when you talk about security of supply. The second thing you'll notice here is that we were once a nation that exported electricity. Not because we necessarily wanted to become that, but quite simply because for Germany, over the past 70 years, it was always of great importance. We are not a country rich in raw materials. We are a country that requires energy.
And with this energy, we produce excellent steel, we produce excellent automobiles.
By now, we have become an importing country, primarily from France, from Denmark, and by that I mean also Norway and Sweden. And these are now the nations on which we are dependent. And why is that actually the case? And that brings me back to what you have suggested here. We simply need to expand solar and wind because they complement each other, and then we'll have security of supply. When I drove here, I quickly checked what our electricity looked like at 4 p.m. So it's definitely still a time of day when people are still working and the electricity demand is still relatively high. The solar power coverage, however, by 4 p.m. in winter is practically non-existent. And wind and solar power covered 15%. And you have to consider two things. This is a relatively common value, especially in winter. In summer, at lunchtime, they tend to have surpluses, but in winter, we have a very big problem. So, and that's 15%, even though we have 3 times the overcapacity. That means we've installed 3 times the power pause compared to the actual consumption we have. So you can roughly imagine what else we might need around here.
So, and where does our electricity come from then, I ask? Well, certainly not from renewable energy.
The electricity comes from a bit further west of here, specifically from the French nuclear power plants. So, at 4 o'clock, they exported the output of 3 nuclear power plants to us. 3 nuclear power plants? Yes, that's exactly what we just shut down. What a coincidence.
And that's still by no means the highest level that the French sometimes manage to achieve, because it also happens that the sun and wind...
No. They don't necessarily complement each other. Just look at how often they don't complement each other. This year in November, we even had phases where they only supplied just over 2% of our electricity needs, even though the entire Uckermark is fully built out. It's all to no avail. If there's no wind, there's no wind. And if the sun doesn't shine, which happens very frequently in winter, even during the day, then there's no solar power available either. And if you only have 2%, well, then 98% must come from somewhere else. That's why Mrs.
Construct gas power plants.
Will it be attacked again with the argument, it's all fossil fuels anyway? I'll show you a very interesting image here. By beautiful, I mean it ironically, of course. What you see here in the middle is the installed capacity of wind power. You can see it was rapidly built up. Solar was even more drastic, but wind has been steadily built up since 2015. So on the left, you see the wind power fed into our power grid. And if you look closely now, you'll see my mouse isn't visible, unfortunately. What a shame. If you look very closely at them, you will notice that these bars have not changed since the year 2020. They do, of course, still vary from year to year, because obviously some years are a bit windier and some years are a bit less windy. The whole situation is a matter of pure chance. But since 2020, we've been building out new capacity like world champions, and yet we haven't fed any more wind power into the grid. The reason for this, I can now refer once again to an interview. I believe there are even 2 interviews that Mr. Birnbaum, who is the CEO of E.ON, conducted with the Süddeutsche Zeitung. The one thing is, if you search for it on Google, it's very nicely titled with a quote from him, "That is absolute madness." I can only agree with that, because what's happening here is we've added so much wind power that in really windy times, autumn storms, spring storms, so much is fed in that the grid operators have to regulate it all away. This means a large part of why we can't get more power out of here is because the entire infrastructure cannot handle it. And that in turn is because a Mr. Habeck, or let's say representatively, the entire traffic light coalition went ahead and in the best planned. I have always said that a planned economy was a good idea. 2% on everything except pet food. So 2% should be implemented everywhere to achieve this dream. This is the result we're seeing right here. We have absolutely no control over this. Why is it that we don't have any control? Because the wind power operators are compensated for all of these curtailments. And that is, in point of fact, the real actual scandal. So they are continuing to build quite aggressively, and they are currently building extremely aggressively because they are primarily afraid that Ms. Reicher or other individuals might implement measures here that could potentially reduce their subsidies or call into question these ambitious expansion goals. That's why they're currently applying for something that's truly magnificent. So what we then see is they have absolutely no risk involved. If curtailment becomes necessary, meaning if they can't produce any electricity between 12 and 6 p.m., they will receive precisely this revenue compensated by the electricity customers. And that brings me now to the subject of why our prices are rising so significantly. That's just one part of it, but not the only factor. The main takeaway is, and here I'll say it to the CEO of E.ON, but it's not just the CEO of E.ON. This is also what the reports say, which were analyzed for Ms. Reicher by McKinsey, by Boston Consulting. We have a tremendous problem. It can be described as absolute madness. Mr. Birnbaum then gives examples. There are areas where everything is already covered with wind turbines, but construction continues regardless. During periods of very strong winds, the electricity simply cannot be used. There's absolutely no benefit whatsoever to be gained from any further expansion. And therefore, he says, we must first abandon this current path, this idea of completely covering the entire Federal Republic with construction, quite apart from the ecological damage. We first need a comprehensive inventory to determine where wind turbines still make any sense at all. And in a market economy, the best guiding principle would be to state that if you build something here where the electricity cannot be utilized at all, you will receive no compensation. But certain forces also prevent that from happening. Well, what exactly is the consequence of all of this? Household electricity prices have been continuously increasing for the past 20 years. Well, you all know when you receive mail from your utility provider, it's an information letter, then it's usually not good news. Expressed in numbers, the flat bars you see on the graph show the development of household electricity prices up to 2025, and the orange graphs, those bars there, show the development of the consumer price index. So you see electricity prices have risen much more sharply than the inflation rate, much more sharply. You all know, you're all familiar with the development. And now I've taken the liberty to add 1 or 2 green bars here, because the reaction isn't that we could say, oh, renewables help us to lower electricity prices. No, the reaction even from the current federal government is, let's subsidize. We urgently need lower electricity prices, and for that purpose, the minimum payments from 2022 were covered by the taxpayer. He wasn't asked, but that's how it was done. What this means is, this particular decline that you're seeing here for 2023, which the Green Party is always quite proud of, comes about because a portion of your electricity bill you are paying as a taxpayer. And for each kilowatt hour of renewable electricity, an average of 7 cents per kilowatt hour is still paid. So you should always keep that in mind when you look at your electricity bill. And under the current government, this will get even more intense because they also want the grid costs, which are driven up by renewables, to be shifted. Until now, the electricity customer paid for them, but now the taxpayer should also pay for them. So, on the one hand, we subsidize the operators who generate the electricity, and on the other hand, we subsidize the electricity prices down a bit again. They could have thought of this for signs as well. Now one might ask, has the electricity price also risen in other European countries? Not necessarily. These are the household electricity prices from October 2025. On the left, leading all alone, so at least in that area we are consistently European champions. That is Germany. And bear in mind, these prices are without the massive subsidies we use to support electricity here in Germany. Then in the middle is France, then even cheaper is, for example, Sweden, and quite far to the right here is Hungary. This is the country where Mercedes-Benz and Bosch from Schwäbisch Gmünd are now relocating. That's where the production capacities are now being built. So Hungary is the new work hard, build your future nation. And this here is a very interesting graphic. The hypothesis, you see, is always that eventually it will be good. Now, if you take a look at this graph here, you'll see on the x-axis the share of solar and wind in the electricity mix. That is what was, for example, 15% here. And here you have the household electricity price. This here is the image from 2019, and this here is the image from 2023. What you see here, some countries like Germany, Denmark have expanded solar and wind power, so they've moved to the right on this graph, but their electricity prices have also gone up. This means you're seeing an almost perfect correlation here. The higher the solar and wind share in the power mix, the higher the power price. It can never be perfect because each country's individual control can also play a role. But the connection is clear. And above all, one thing is clear. This quadrant down here, it is not occupied at all. The combination of high wind and solar power and a low electricity price doesn't exist anywhere in the world. So, it's not a German failure, though it certainly could be. But it's fundamentally the case that system costs from solar and wind make electricity prices extremely high. And that becomes all the more noticeable the higher its share becomes. What are the reasons for this? Well, we have 4 reasons. One is the shutdown of guaranteed capacity. And that, of course, brings me to nuclear power plants. And I always find it so amusing when politicians from, I won't name any parties now, when politicians say, no, that's not true. We did shut down our nuclear power plants, but electricity prices have not increased. That is complete and utter nonsense because macroeconomics tells you very clearly there is a balance between supply and demand. And if you were to remove a significant portion of the supply right now, specifically and quite coincidentally the one that is relatively inexpensive, available 24/7, then you would inevitably find a new equilibrium price, which would then be considerably higher. Because what is lost there was then covered by more expensive producers. That's actually first semester economics. But it's not really mastered in politics. It's still being claimed. I mean, to be fair, if we were to curtail all wind power plants, the effect would be exactly the same. So if you decrease the supply and the demand remains constant, then it's simply the case that prices will increase. And this can also be demonstrated analytically. I'll just skip over this a little bit. The second point is the nuclear phase-out. There's hardly a connection that can be demonstrated as clearly as this one specifically. With the shutdown of the last 3 nuclear power plants, we suddenly became import dependent. We've been partially import dependent here occasionally, but you can see in the left branch again and again, Germany had become an export nation. And now there are barely any months left when we could export ourselves. Then they tell you, oh, for goodness sake, that's just European electricity. However, it's now also the case that the Norwegians and Swedes are saying, especially in Norway, we are fed up with continuing to supply this deficient energy system in Germany with power. Because if we send the power there, it gets more expensive for us. That's a drastic effect in Norway. And in France, Macron says, I'd like to use our electricity surpluses for artificial intelligence. I want to build data centers here. French power must remain within our borders. One might not like that, but we've now put ourselves in a situation where we've become dependent on this. So, nuclear power plants are, if you want to put it that way, the most severe political failure since the post-war period. I'm going to stick with that particular point. The second point I want to emphasize is that renewable energies are inherently expensive. This particular aspect certainly requires a more detailed explanation. What I'm presenting to you here with this bar chart is the crucial metric of energy return on energy invested. The amount of energy that is extracted from a wind power plant or a nuclear power plant or a gas power plant when compared to the energy that needs to be invested, for example, for the construction of the facility, for its ongoing maintenance, or even for fuel costs. I've gone into a bit more detail on this here because people are always talking about how the interior has become so great and calm weather is no problem at all there anymore. Southern Germany is totally suitable. Yes, this is something we can now take a moment to consider. Specifically, when it comes to wind power here in the interior, the factor is approximately 15. If you go near the coast, it's about 20. If I also demand that this power be supplied continuously, which is often forgotten, so you need to add storage, then their energy consumption is also included. Then you're looking at values of 10 and 14.5. And these differences in value here, they are currently quite brutally determining whether a project is even economically viable or not. That's how it is along the coast. Offshore is currently experiencing a complete collapse, but there are also specific locations around the world, such as Patagonia and Namibia, which are exceptionally well suited for wind power generation. But that does not apply to southern Germany, not in the slightest. And when it's repeatedly claimed here, yes, the facilities are so modern today, it makes absolutely no difference. That was even in the BNN yesterday. You would only have to ask one single question. Can you put up this wind turbine without any subsidies? I can tell you one thing. If the news just came in that wind power subsidies are being cut, if that news came in right now, we could all go have a beer together. Then the whole topic would be dead. Aber Mausebrot. So the difference, especially when compared to nuclear power, is quite significant. You can see, therefore, that there's a factor of 5 involved here. And that actually makes it quite evident what we are truly dealing with in this situation. This is, in fact, a truly enormous material expenditure. This holds true for both wind energy and solar power. And of course, there is a massive land requirement that you have here. So if you consider Neckar-Westheim 2, just that single reactor alone, you could roughly say it's equivalent to about 800 wind turbines. Now just imagine that for a moment. That represents a massive change, both in terms of energy production and the land area we are utilizing. Perhaps just one more observation. What you are seeing here is also a direct consequence of the industrialization that has taken place over the last 500 years. Before the steam engine, we had been entirely dependent on renewable sources, wind power, solar energy, also hydropower, and of course wood. Then came the steam engine. Then on this particular branch, you encounter gas power and coal power, both with an EUI of 30. And if you then proceed even further, you arrive at nuclear power in the 20th century, and then you're at an EUI of 75. So, what we're doing here, if we revert to 100% wind and solar, we are precisely turning back on this very path. Subsidies, I just mentioned them. Yes, here too, nothing works without subsidies. So far, approximately 500 billion euros have flowed. 6 trillion euros are needed. This is a McKinsey study. From my perspective, it's the most credible study, but that doesn't matter. Every study in this field is somewhere between 3 and 10 trillion euros. At that point, the precise figure hardly even matters. The crucial point is, and here I refer back to Mr. Scholz, that to the extent we lose our industry, to that same extent we also lose the economic power needed to fund such investments. Quite simply, where is all that money supposed to come from? If we continue to pursue such a course towards a recession, then the energy transition will quite simply and plainly perish because it will just not be financially viable or affordable. And once again, because this is also about Baden-Württemberg and the supposedly affordable wind turbines, which pay for themselves. It was the wind power industry in 2022 that besieged Mr. Habeck. You urgently need to increase subsidies. That's again subsidies, EEG tariffs, minimum tariffs. We can't build profitably anymore. It's always rather exciting. I'm always told it's the unbeatably cheapest energy and power source.
But it always needs more subsidies or it can't be operated. I think those who argue this way don't even notice the contradiction anymore.
The problem we have here is that it was then said, but we need a substantial financial contribution for southern Germany. What this implies is that the standard EEG remuneration, which is currently set at 7.304 cents, will be massively increased for southern German locations by as much as 55%, depending on the specific profitability of those particular sites. If it's truly a high altitude rich location with good wind, then it's a bit less of an issue. But here, even the lowlands are being built up, despite extremely poor wind power conditions. And what then happens here is this. The subsidies here are then shot up to more than 11 cents. Then people wonder why no industrial buyer will take it anymore. So all of this actually doesn't work at all anymore. And this is a very, very big problem that we have here. 55% surcharge, and the reason we're all meeting here today, and I've been to many places before, the reason is always the same. They're all afraid that these subsidies will eventually be questioned too much. That's why everything must be quickly built up now, because once these subsidies are secured, they are guaranteed for 20 years. This means if a plant is constructed here with these EEG tariffs, then the subsidy is secure until 2046-47. The next generation will curse us for this, just as they'll curse us for the pension issue. And one more example. Why is this whole thing such a huge load of nonsense? It is an undisputed fact that wind power generation adheres to a V-cubed law.
This means that for the same installation, the wind energy yields increase by the third power. And that's precisely why locations in southern Germany are simply not profitable. If we were to go and say, we'll increase the subsidies, the weaker the location is, that is absolute insanity. That would be like the European Union saying, we need pineapples throughout all of Europe. And in Lapland, it's more expensive than in Sicily, so Lapland receives more subsidies. This is the reason why we are sitting here tonight. It has no market-based control. And I have now more or less complained about the traffic light government. The new one has not yet proven that it will do better. The September assessment had been good. It is an outstanding piece of work. However, the subsidies are still increasing. Next year, we will exceed 30 billion. And these are indeed subsidies. 20 billion. Actually, not quite 18 billion of that goes directly to the operators and everyone else. The taxpayer then cushions the follow-up costs of renewables, namely the enormously high grid costs. And if we're already putting over 30 billion into that, then we're not far from basic citizens' income. So, this is a massive cost item that we're dealing with. There's no way we can get around that. I'll just skip this part for now. And here I have another good example. But I must admit, the curve is a little bit complicated. But this blue corridor represents the minimum remuneration rates under the EEG, and consequently South German locations are positioned very high up. They therefore receive minimum remuneration payments of 11 cents. At the same time, however, there's something else, and that's called the cannibalization effect of renewables. When the sun shines brightly, all solar power plants in Germany produce like mad. When the wind blows strongly, and then during an autumn storm, the same applies to all wind power plants. And this results in the price received by the windmiller constantly decreasing. I found a study here from Enervis, which is generally an RE-friendly research institute, and they stated that the market values for wind will continue to fall even further. Simply put, because due to this overproduction during times when a lot of wind blows, prices massively plummet. They are also increasingly moving into the negative range. And that means the difference between these 11.3 cents and the market prices that wind power achieves, that difference is growing larger and larger. And that simply drives the subsidies completely up. However, that's not the only problem. Network costs, that's something you can figure out relatively quickly. It was the case 20 years ago or even 30 years ago. Electricity was generated by large power plants. These major power plants were strategically placed close to industrial consumption hubs. Take Neckar-Westheim, for instance, situated close to the Rhine-Neckar region's main hub. The coal-fired power plants in Saarland, for example, were then established near the steel industry. The same pattern applied in the Ruhr region, and so on and so forth. So it became quite clear then they needed a defined network infrastructure which would ultimately always route from the large-scale producer to the corresponding consumer. So now I'm replacing this large producer, for instance, Block Neckar-Westheim 2, with 800 wind turbines. And these 800 wind turbines are scattered all over the country, everywhere in the beautiful forests. And naturally, that's why I always find it so funny when calculations are made here about how much space is consumed. Whoever calculates like that, of course, only considers the immediate location of the wind turbine, but these things also need a distance from each other. And within that distance, the areas are then completely overwhelmed by these wind turbines, especially for all the flora and fauna in between. But what I'm trying to say is, you naturally have to connect these wind farms to the national grid. So you need grid connections, you then need substations and transformers, which, by the way, are also hard to get, making everything much, much more expensive. This means you have to connect every small generator generation plant. However, they had connected Neckar-West Stream 2, but now 800 small wind turbines all need their own connection. And that is, of course, associated with enormous grid costs. The second point is that grid costs are becoming more expensive due to these increasing interventions because they no longer have a constant output, but instead have a completely random generation where the entire generation can repeatedly collapse like a stone within just 4 hours. It's like if within 4 hours, 2/3 of France's nuclear power plants suddenly went offline. These are the kinds of problems that grid operators here have to deal with. They must intervene, that's then called redispatch, and these costs are now also climbing into the billions. When I speak with French colleagues, they have no idea what is meant by that. They don't have that, they only have it to a limited extent, specifically when nuclear power plants are taken offline for maintenance. And precisely this point must be shut down. Here you have a constant level of increasing interventions in the grid, and that costs money. Here you can clearly see the instability of the wind power plants. There you observe such sharp fluctuations like those seen here on this Monday the 6th. This happens incredibly quickly, and you go from a state where you still have sufficient wind, then everything collapses for you within 2 or 3 hours, leading to a situation where gas power plants must be urgently switched on because all the wind turbines in Germany have just decided not to deliver any more wind. So, technologically, this is actually an absolute nightmare. It's essentially the Middle Ages, where you were always dependent on whether the sun was shining or the wind was blowing. That's exactly what we have here. I just mentioned the grid expansion costs. Then there's also the issue, this entire Habeck plan for 2% across the country that's driving up our grid costs. And perhaps, Ms. Tome, you should once again adjust your plans much more precisely, because this significant increase in electricity, I mean, I'm no specialist for Bruchsal, but I would seriously question that. Just due to deindustrialization, you'll lose a great deal there. And an important point to make is that this entire expansion plan by Habeck, which has brought us all together here today, is completely overdimensioned. And it leads to enormous grid costs. I have a study here, and there are various other studies estimating these costs at 730 billion euros. So this is just one component of those 6 trillion euros. And here we have a massive cost block, which could actually perhaps even be reduced. It could be reduced, especially if we retained enough supply secure sources. Germany's path is unique. Nowhere else is it occurring to this significant extent that one would truly aim for 100% with wind and solar power. But this reality hasn't quite been fully understood yet. The crucial topic of storage was just mentioned by Ms. Thomas as well. That is quite an interesting and amusing subject indeed. Storage has 2 main components. Well, for one thing, I am definitely a proponent of storage. People often ask me, I have a solar system and I'm quite satisfied with it. Should I still buy a storage unit? My answer is always household electricity prices will continue to rise, especially when the government runs out of money and storage prices have fallen, so buy one. That makes sense. But if I look around here in our Saarland region and I look towards Dilling at the steelworks there, I look at the automotive industry, so I have to hurry while they still exist. And then I have to state very clearly we are dealing with completely different dimensions here. A storage unit on the roof won't be sufficient then. Not on the roof, I'm afraid. Solar on the roof and the storage unit won't be of much use there either. I would need absolutely enormous dimensions for that. My colleague, the Chief Technology Officer, Dr. Alban, once wrote a scientific publication on this very topic. We need to keep available 40 to 45 terawatt hours of electricity just for those dark lulls in winter. And that's not even the most aggressive estimate. There are other numbers that mention 70, 80 terawatt hours, but 40 to 45 terawatt hours. That means we'd need to store about 6 weeks worth of electricity consumption to truly get through an energy drought. If not, then electricity will have to be rationed accordingly. And a lot of nonsense is being talked about this topic of battery storage, because right now it's become quite common to attack Ms. Reiche everywhere. They're calling her Gaskati now, and such pleasantries are being spread around. Everyone knows the fact that it simply won't work without gas power plants. But a certain political party then just claims that it can only be done with storage. If I just take these 40 to 45 terawatt hours, and that's not even the most aggressive estimate, and say that this needs to be addressed with storage, then even with relatively conservative costs, I've calculated 100 to 250 euros per kilowatt hour for a storage system. So we are not there yet. But let's just say one might perhaps achieve them. Then we would incur costs of 5 to 12.5 trillion euros just for that. And these are, of course, costs. I mean, a storage unit, even your battery pack doesn't last forever. That would then arise for us again every 30 years. This is also parallel to the fact that a wind turbine only lasts a maximum of 25 to 30 years. That is complete nonsense. And frankly, scientists who support the energy transition don't even claim that. That only comes from politics. This is a diagram of the storage we currently have. The bottom line is we're in a storage deficit. There was a lady who once said we still had some but not enough storage. However, we're still 1,000 orders of magnitude away from anything that could be remotely useful. So that is a chimera. Sailing through the lands, my conclusion, the first point is, and now I'm referring to a literature review, a system that relies entirely on wind and solar power that will become extremely expensive in Germany. We have a study here that I have consulted. These are the blue bars, which indicate that for wind and solar, their generation costs alone amount to 22 and 23 cents per kilowatt hour. This figure represents a lower limit. What's particularly interesting here is the comparison with Texas. That's the orange bar. In Texas, the situation looks quite different. In Texas, a system like that would certainly be quite conceivable. They have a relatively large amount of wind along what I believe is now called the Gulf of America, and they also have a great deal of sunshine there in Texas. Yes, it would naturally be much more worthwhile there. Then there's also this storage requirement, because in winter it's not the same as here. The electricity storage need is also significantly lower, and then with a system that relies 100% on wind and solar, you could achieve a cost level that nuclear energy also reaches, around 9 to 10 cents. And unfortunately, they still have additional system costs on top. This means that even in Texas, such a system is more expensive than nuclear power. But in Germany, it is extremely expensive. And this is what studies like these clearly demonstrate. And now empirical reality also shows us this. It's especially the grid fees that are driving up why electricity prices. Yes, I mentioned it. I've shown the McKinsey study here. Future electricity demand pathway. So brace yourselves. We will, by 2035, if this course is maintained, if we follow Habeck's logic, distributing 2% to everything here, and in Bruchsal and Altötting, wind turbines are built everywhere against all reason, then household electricity prices will land somewhere around 50 cents. Analysis by McKinsey. And that is quite plausible. And the increase then comes primarily from the grid costs that are extracted here. There would be more favorable scenarios, but the wind power lobby and its allied party are still very successfully fending them off at the moment. So, 50 cents. And mind you, this amount is already adjusted for inflation. So these are the 50 cents in 2023 prices, not in the prices of 2035. The general inflation will then still be added on top of that. Now the question is this, yeah? If I've explained all of this to you now, I need to wrap things up, but I'm getting there. If I've explained all of this to you now, why would the mayor from Bruchsal then commit to it? Or a mayor from Schriesheim or in Saarland, shall I name a municipality for you? The reason is perfectly clear here. That was the build. Mayor sounds the alarm. Almost every city is bankrupt. Perhaps that's an exaggeration, but that's the direction every city is currently heading. Rastatt, facing a severe budget crisis, now has only 1 million euros in business tax revenue, a staggering 99% decline. This means that the green deindustrialization we are witnessing here is brutally impacting local municipal budgets. And the costs that are currently incurred in the social sector, they naturally remain exactly the same. And meanwhile, the wind power industry is paying absolutely horrendous amounts for the land leases. So typically, 200,000 euros are now practically referred to as the standard. And mind you, that's just for the lease. Where is all this wind power coming from? Oh yes, a bit more than they can make from forest management. But in Hesse, 450,000 euros per installation have already been demanded. A mayor can certainly be tempted by that if you sit with the treasurer and don't know how 2026 will work. I have understanding for that. So I wouldn't blame any local politician if he says, come on, I'll just access it now. If not, I'll end up now, at the latest in a year under forced administration. Yes, that's how it is. But you really need to take a look at how this all comes about. Because without any subsidies, especially in southern Germany, not a single wind power plant is profitable. What this means is that the entire system we have here is actually a pyramid scheme. As the federal government, we are paying the corresponding subsidies for the EEG feed-in tariff. These sums are then paid to the operators. With this, they receive prices that they need to generate electricity even in low wind areas. And at the same time, the operators went to the mayor and said, you have financial problems, don't you? I'll give you a high lease payment here. And that's how the system operates. This means you can, of course, say that small groups, even entire kindergarten groups, can be financed through it. Yes, certainly, absolutely. Or you'll also see in the local press those very atmospheric pictures. The inauguration of the new fire station made possible by the new wind turbine. But that is a pyramid scheme. Ladies and gentlemen, that works everywhere throughout the federal territory. Everywhere, these 2% quotas are expected to be achieved. This means that all these financial contributions which cities receive as lease payments are ultimately borne by us, the taxpayers. And this occurs through a complex mechanism that then flows through the actual wind farm operator. And that particular operator then produces electricity that is significantly overpriced and causes very high network costs. Well, I have a certain term for this system that I've just described, but I'm going to tell you. All right, I'm wrapping this up now. What conclusions can we draw from this? I always have 5 points for a moratorium on expanding wind and solar energy. And strangely enough, I increasingly find myself discussing this topic in various circles. The company of reasonable people, I must honestly say, because even those who say, no, we'd prefer to maintain a mix of wind and solar. And that brings me back to Mr. Birnbaum. But I'm with various analysts who then say, hold on, this expansion as it's currently happening in Germany is not system compatible. So that means there's now a pretty fundamental consensus that this cannot continue like this. Some, like me, say I see no future in it in any form. Others say we need to build less, but then we'll need to rely on more gas-fired power plants. However, something absolutely must happen. Things simply cannot continue this way. But I have a strong feeling that I'll still be organizing quite a few more events just like this one. We urgently need secured capacities. Mrs. Reiche doesn't do that because she's gas-catty, but out of a sense of responsibility. Because in a situation like the one we're in now, we'll never manage with wind and solar. Storage systems are far too expensive. They are a completely illusory construct. So we need gas power plants. But if you build gas power plants, and each gas power plant is all in all only in operation for 2 weeks, and is constantly turned on, turned off, turned on, turned off, then you'll know just how costly that's going to be. So it's completely illusory to believe that we in any way with such a system could ever match the electricity prices of the USA or China. We need to return to nuclear power. It would also actually be no.
It also wouldn't make a difference.
Because I always ask myself, what's the difference whether we import French nuclear power with the risk that the French might eventually use the electricity for themselves, or if we generate it ourselves? There's no big difference. And we have the same issue with gas. We don't do fracking, but we take fracked gas from the USA. That makes absolutely no sense. The state and the rest is simply technological openness and a market economy, above all else. I'm not someone who's looking for radical solutions. The issue is simply this: abolish these subsidies for renewables, abolish these land targets. If someone wants to build wind power plant somewhere and finds a location that is profitable from the market, then as an economist, I would certainly say, yes, please, but that is simply not the case anywhere. But we finally need to have an open mind again about what has transpired here in Germany. We face competition from all sides. These renewable energies, to which they are hopelessly inferior, we forcibly shut down. There was never a market reason for it, and now we suddenly notice that everything has become so expensive. Oh, what a surprise. We need technological openness that says market. If you have a specific form of power generation that is profitable. Take the example of wind power in Texas. Yes, certainly it is profitable there. Or wind in Namibia. Sure, no problem at all. Offshore wind was always my favorite, but it's somehow not worth it. The prices have become too expensive. So, but with technological openness, we can tackle this issue. We definitely won't manage this issue if we continue to pursue this path of a planned economy. As Germans, from our very recent past, we actually know how this will end, and the path we're seeing now is the same one we saw with that other German republic. Can it be reversed? I don't know. My final word on this referendum was just hinted at along the lines of I must confess, I was quite startled when I watched that recording and then listened to it once more from the representative of the energy source, who then ultimately said at the very end,
But we must be absolutely honest here, and we have to state this very clearly right now. If you choose to turn down this project, then we will simply seek out private providers.
And to me, that sounded a bit like a threat. Then we'll get much closer to your residential areas. I'm always surprised because wind farm operators always say when they want to build 500 meters away, it has no consequences for residents. But here they're saying, we are telling you this as a threat now. We'll build closer to you then. So honestly, it sent shivers down my spine, and I've had my share of experiences with this industry. To be perfectly honest, I consider it a wonderful thing when citizen referendums take place, because ultimately that is the democratic process. And for me, it's always been perfectly clear. If my fellow campaigners lose a public referendum, then that's simply the way it is. Then democracy has spoken, even if I see things completely differently. If a wind power developer comes here and says, we'll proceed with this regardless, it's entirely beside the point what you decide there. And to be perfectly honest, if you do, will punish you even more, and then things will get even worse for you, then I consider that to be an act of contempt for democracy. And there is nothing more to be said about that. Thank you very much.
Many heartfelt thanks, Dr. Canne, for this fact-based presentation.
Es ist wirklich Wahnsinn, was